The classroom was noisy that morning. Students were talking, laughing, and passing notes when the teachers walked in. Everyone quickly grew quiet, waiting to see what the day would bring. It wasn't an ordinary day. There was a talent activity planned. The teachers said students could come forward and show a skill. Sing, dance, or perform something small. At first it sounded fun, but for one student, it would soon turn into something cruel. Amara sat near the back of the room, quietly reading her notebook. She was a shy black girl who rarely spoke unless someone asked her a direct question. She always finished her work on time, but she didn't stand out much. Her silence made her an easy target for jokes. Some students teased her, calling her names, while teachers often ignored her. To most of them, she was invisible. As the first few students performed, the class clapped and cheered. One boy sang loudly, making everyone laugh. A girl danced to a pop song. The room was full of energy. That's when one of the teachers, Mr. Collins, glanced toward the back and noticed Amara sitting quietly. He whispered something to another teacher, and both of them smirked. "Amara," Mr. Collins called out suddenly. His voice carried across the room. Amara looked up, startled. "Why don't you come up here and show us what you can do?" The students turned their heads toward her. Some snickered, others whispered, "She won't do anything. She's too shy." Amara froze, her hands gripping her notebook tightly. She didn't want to be the center of attention. She hated the way people laughed at her when she spoke too softly or made a small mistake. Before she could respond, another teacher, Ms. Hayes, picked up the old violin that sat in the corner of the room. It had been left there for years, dusty and unused. "Here," she said with a mocking smile. "Why don't you play the violin for us?" The room erupted in laughter. Students giggled and whispered, "Yeah, let her play. This will be funny." A boy in the front row muttered loudly, "She probably doesn't even know how to hold it." The teachers chuckled too, shaking their heads as if they were setting up a harmless joke. Amara's cheeks burned. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. Waiting to laugh even harder, she wanted to say no. She wanted to sink into her chair and disappear. But the teachers were staring at her, and she knew refusing would only make things worse. Slowly, she stood up, her legs shaking. She walked to the front of the classroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispers grew louder behind her. Students were already mocking her before she had even touched the instrument. "This is going to be so embarrassing," someone whispered. Amara heard it and her heart pounded. Ms. Hayes handed her the violin. The wood was scratched and the strings were slightly worn. It didn't look like much, but to the teachers and students, it was nothing more than a prop for their amusement. "Go on," the teacher said with a smirk, folding her arms. "Show us what you've got." The laughter rose again. Some kids clapped mockingly. Others leaned forward, eager to see her fail. Amara held the violin close to her chest, her hands trembling slightly for a moment. She felt like dropping it and running back to her seat. But then something shifted inside her. She remembered the nights she had spent in her small bedroom. Practicing quietly, she remembered her grandmother's voice, telling her, "When you play, let the music speak for you, even when words can't." Her grandmother had once been a violinist, but she never got the chance to perform on big stages. Amara had learned from her, carrying her dream forward now, standing in front of a room full of people waiting for her to fail. Amara realized she had a choice. She could let them laugh, or she could let the violin speak. The teachers leaned back in their chairs, certain this would end in disaster. The students giggled and exchanged looks. Amara lifted the violin slowly. Placing it against her shoulder, she took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the floor for a moment. Then she raised her bow. The room quieted just slightly, not because they respected her, but because they were ready for the joke to begin. No one expected anything good in their minds. This shy girl with her head down was about to make a fool of herself. But Amara's hand stopped trembling as soon as the bow touched the strings. The laughter still buzzed behind her, but in her mind, she could already hear the music waiting to come alive. She gripped the bow firmly, her back straightened, and for the first time that day, her eyes lifted, not with fear but with quiet determination. The prank was set, the trap was ready, the whole room was waiting to laugh. But what none of them knew was that the joke would not be on Amara. It would be on them. The violin felt heavy in Amara's hands, not because of its weight, but because of the eyes staring at her. The entire classroom was waiting, their smirks and whispers filling the air. She could hear the giggles, the cruel little comments sliding between the desks like snakes. One boy in the back whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She's gonna screech like a dying cat." Laughter followed. The sound stabbed at Amara's heart, another girl muttered. "She doesn't even know what to do with that thing." A wave of chuckles rippled through the room. The teachers didn't stop it, they only smiled. Folding their arms, satisfied with the prank they had set, Mr. Collins leaned against his desk, his voice thick with sarcasm. "All right, Amara, impress us. Play something beautiful." His words dripped with mockery. The students laughed even louder, some even clapping their hands as though this was a comedy show instead of a classroom. Amara kept her head low, her dark curls falling slightly over her face. She gripped the violin tighter. Her palms were sweaty, and for a moment she felt her knees shake. The temptation to put it down and walk away burned inside her. But then she remembered her grandmother's voice, soft yet firm in her memory. "Never let their laughter steal your song." The students were restless. One boy cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Come on, play already." The room erupted again. Laughter bounced off the walls. The prank was working, or so they thought. Amara lifted her eyes slowly. Her gaze swept across the room. She saw the smirks, the mocking eyes, the folded arms of the teachers who had chosen her as a target. And in that moment, something inside her hardened. The fear was still there, but it was changing, transforming into something stronger. She raised the violin to her shoulder. Her movements were calm, deliberate. Almost too slow for the crowd, they laughed again, mistaking her composure for clumsiness. "Look, she doesn't even know how to hold it." A girl shouted, more giggles followed. Ms. Hayes chuckled, shaking her head. "Go on then, Amara. Let's hear it." Her tone was mocking, but there was a flicker of impatience now too. She wanted the joke to play out quickly. She wanted the laugh to be big, but Amara was no longer hearing their words clearly. Their voices blurred into background noise. Her fingers curled around the bow with certainty. She had done this 1,000 times in her bedroom. Late at night when the world was quiet, she had practiced scales until her hands ached, memorized pieces until they became part of her heartbeat. She inhaled deeply, blocking out the sound of their laughter. In her mind, she wasn't in a classroom anymore. She was in her grandmother's living room, where the old violin had first been placed in her hands. She was a little girl again, listening to her grandmother's soft encouragement. The class was still chuckling, waiting for the disaster they believed was about to unfold. Amara pressed the violin against her shoulder and raised her bow. A hush fell for just a second, not out of respect, but anticipation. They were ready to laugh harder than before. Her fingers found their place on the strings with practiced ease. Her bow hovered for a heartbeat. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself, and whispered in her mind, "This is for you, Grandma." And then she began to play. The first sound that emerged wasn't the screech they expected. It wasn't clumsy, broken, or harsh. It was clear, strong, and beautiful. The note cut through the air like light breaking through a storm. The laughter died instantly. The students blinked, the smiles sliding off their faces. The teachers straightened in their chairs, shocked. The second note followed, then the third, flowing together into a melody so pure it seemed impossible that it came from the same violin they had treated as a joke. Amara's hands no longer trembled. Her bow glided across the strings with confidence. Her fingers moved with precision. The music filled the room, echoing off the walls, wrapping itself around every listener. The room that had been full of laughter just seconds ago was now silent. Utterly silent, Amara kept her eyes closed as she played. She didn't need to see their faces to know the joke had backfired. She poured her heart into every note, letting the music speak where her words never could. Every sound was a reminder that she was not weak. Not a fool, not someone to laugh at. She was a musician, and her voice was in the strings of her violin. A girl who had been laughing the loudest earlier now sat frozen, her mouth slightly open. A boy in the back who had mocked her leaned forward without realizing it, his expression shifting from mockery to awe. Even the teachers who had started the prank exchanged uneasy glances, their smug confidence gone. Amara didn't stop. She played on. Stronger with every passing second, the laughter was gone, replaced by silence so deep it felt sacred. The same violin they had given her as a joke had become her weapon, her shield, her truth. And as the final note of the melody lingered in the air, fading slowly into silence, Amara opened her eyes. She saw their faces, the shock, the guilt, the disbelief, and for the first time she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The prank had failed. The laughter had died. and Amara had just taken her first step into triumph. The bow touched the strings, and the very first note changed everything. The students, who had been leaning forward with cruel grins, expecting noise and mistakes, froze in their seats. The sound that came from the violin wasn't broken or clumsy. It was smooth, deep, and beautiful, like a voice that had been waiting in silence for the right moment to speak. At first, the silence was stunned. The laughter died so quickly that it felt like the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. The mocking smirks melted into wide eyes. Some students blinked, unsure if what they heard was real. Amara's bow slid gracefully across the strings. Her fingers pressed each note with certainty. Every sound carried through the air like waves, filling the classroom. The harsh giggles that once echoed off the walls were replaced with music so rich and alive that it seemed to wrap itself around every person in the room. She played with confidence even though her heart was still racing. She had practiced this piece for months, playing it late at night when her grandmother's words guided her hands. "Play as if the violin is speaking for your soul," her grandmother had always said. Now those words came to life. Amara's eyes stayed closed as she played. She wasn't performing for them, not for the teachers, not for the students who mocked her. She was performing for herself, for the little girl who had been overlooked, for her grandmother, who once dreamed of standing on a stage. For every moment she had been told she wasn't good enough. The melody grew stronger, flowing like a river. The more she played, the lighter her hands felt. The fear that once weighed her down melted away, replaced by power. She was no longer the shy girl in the back of the class. She was a musician, commanding the room with every note. The students exchanged looks, whispering quietly now, but not with insults. "She can actually play," one boy muttered under his breath. Another girl, who had been laughing the loudest earlier, sat wide-eyed, her mouth slightly open. For the first time, the mockery turned into respect. Even the teachers couldn't hide their shock. Mr. Collins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His arms, once crossed with smug amusement, dropped slowly to his sides. "Ms. Hayes blinked several times, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. They had set her up for failure, but instead, she was giving them a performance they would never forget. The music filled every corner of the classroom, rising and falling like a voice telling a story without words. It was soft at times, gentle and tender, then strong and powerful, demanding attention. Some students closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, forgetting entirely that just minutes ago they were waiting to laugh. Amara felt the shift in the room. She didn't need to see it. She could feel it. The silence wasn't heavy with cruelty anymore. It was heavy with awe. Every note she played was reclaiming her dignity, turning their prank into her stage. Her bow danced faster across the strings. Her fingers moved quickly, almost effortlessly. The sound grew brighter, more vibrant, like sunlight breaking through clouds. It was no longer just music. It was a declaration, a statement of who she was. When she reached the most powerful part of the piece, the students leaned forward instinctively, completely caught in the moment. Even the usual troublemakers who joked about everything sat still, eyes wide. The violin had silenced them in a way no teacher ever could. A soft gasp escaped from the back of the room as the melody climbed higher. A girl whispered, "It's beautiful," forgetting she had once mocked Amara. Another boy muttered, "She's better than anyone I've ever heard play in this school." His voice was full of disbelief. Amara finally opened her eyes. Her gaze wasn't on the crowd, but on her hands, watching them move with precision and grace. She had dreamed of moments like this, but never imagined it would happen here. In this classroom where she was meant to be humiliated, the irony made her stronger. The teachers glanced at each other. Their faces were red, not from laughter now, but from shame. They couldn't stop her, they couldn't interrupt her. The joke had turned against them completely, and they were powerless to change it. As the music reached its final notes, the room held its breath. Amara drew the bow across the strings one last time, letting the sound linger, soft but commanding. It hung in the air like magic, wrapping the entire room in silence. When the last vibration faded, Amara lowered the violin slowly. The room stayed quiet, so quiet she could hear the clock ticking on the wall. No one moved, no one spoke. They had been waiting for a failure, but what they received was brilliance. Amara finally looked up. Her dark eyes met the stunned faces before her. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply stood tall, holding the violin firmly in her hands. In that silence, she knew she had won. The first note had silenced their laughter, and the last note had captured their respect. The moment Amara finished the opening notes, something inside her changed. She no longer felt like the shy, quiet girl standing in front of a classroom full of people waiting to laugh. She felt powerful. Her fingers moved with a confidence she didn't even know she had. Each sound grew fuller, richer, alive. The classroom, once a noisy stage of jokes and cruelty, had fallen completely silent. The only sound was her violin, weaving through the air like a spell. Students who had leaned back with smirks were now leaning forward, their mouths slightly open. Even the ones who whispered insults earlier were frozen in place. Unable to look away, Amara's eyes closed as she played. The world around her disappeared. She wasn't in that classroom anymore. She was standing in her grandmother's small living room, where the first notes of this very song had been taught to her. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice, warm and proud. "Don't just play the notes, Amara. Tell a story with them." And so she told a story not with words, but with music. The violin sang of sadness, of strength, of hope. It carried her pain, her loneliness, her determination, and poured it into every string. It was no longer just practice, it was freedom. The students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable at first, because they realized they were part of the story too. They had laughed at her, pointed at her, treated her as if she was nothing, but now, her music was showing them who she truly was, and it left them ashamed. One boy whispered to his friend, She's amazing." His friend didn't answer. He was too busy staring, his earlier grin completely gone. A girl in the front row felt tears sting her eyes, embarrassed at how cruel she had been only minutes ago. The teachers sat stiffly at their desks. Mr. Collins cleared his throat, trying to mask his unease. "Ms." Hayes fidgeted with her pen, tapping it nervously. They had started this as a joke, a prank meant to humiliate. But now they were the ones shrinking under the weight of guilt. They had handed Amara the violin to laugh at her, and instead she had turned it into her weapon. Amara's body moved with the rhythm, her bow gliding smoothly. Her music climbed higher, faster, brighter. It filled the room with energy that made everyone's chest tighten. It felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Then she slowed, her notes softening. Like a whisper carried by the wind, the contrast was breathtaking. Her classmates leaned in even more, afraid to miss a single sound. The silence of the room was no longer mocking. It was reverent, like the hush inside a grand concert hall. Amara opened her eyes now, and for the first time since she walked to the front of the room, she looked at her audience. Her gaze swept over the shocked faces, the wide eyes, the teachers who could no longer hide their shame, and she didn't feel small anymore. She didn't feel out of place. She felt strong. Her bow danced across the strings one last time, sending the melody soaring. The sound was so full of life that it made some students forget they were in a classroom at all. It was as if they had been transported somewhere else entirely, somewhere where only the music existed. By the time she reached the final stretch of her piece, the students were no longer whispering, no longer shifting or smirking. They were holding their breath, waiting, knowing instinctively that they were witnessing something rare. Her grandmother had once told her, "Music has the power to change hearts, even the hardest ones," and Amara saw it happening before her eyes. She saw the smug expressions vanish, the mocking smirks replaced by awe. The very people who had set her up to fail were now her audience. Humbled by every note, she ended with a long, lingering note, letting it stretch into silence. It hung in the air like a ribbon of light, refusing to fade quickly. And when it finally disappeared, the room stayed quiet. Amara lowered the violin slowly. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. Her hands were steady now. She looked at them all, her classmates, her teachers, everyone who had doubted her. And in that silence, she understood something powerful. The prank had failed, the laughter had been silenced, and she had transformed not only herself but the entire room. The students who had mocked her now stared at her with wide eyes, ashamed and stunned. The teachers who had orchestrated the joke could not even meet her gaze. They shifted uncomfortably, knowing they had been the fools, not her. Amara stood taller, the violin resting gently at her side. In that moment, she wasn't just the quiet girl in the back of the classroom. She was the girl who turned humiliation into triumph. The girl who let her music speak when words could not, and though she said nothing, her silence was louder than their laughter had ever been. The last note hung in the air, delicate and trembling, before fading into silence. For a long moment no one moved. It was as if time itself had stopped in that classroom. The students sat frozen in their seats, their mouths open, their eyes wide. They had been prepared to laugh, to clap mockingly, to jeer at her mistakes. But now they were stunned into stillness. Amara lowered her bow slowly, her chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. She looked around the room, and the sight before her was unlike anything she had ever seen. The same students who had mocked her seconds earlier now sat pale-faced, ashamed, and speechless. Some looked down at their desks, unable to meet her gaze. Others stared at her with something close to awe. A boy in the back, the same one who had joked she would sound like a dying cat, rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. His smirk was gone, replaced with guilt. He whispered softly, I didn't know she could play like that. But his voice was lost in the quiet. Another girl, who had been among the loudest to laugh, blinked quickly as if holding back tears. Her cheeks turned red as she lowered her eyes. She couldn't bring herself to look at Amara, ashamed of the cruelty she had joined. The teachers who had started the prank looked even more uncomfortable. Mr. Collins shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar as if it were suddenly too tight. His smug expression was gone, replaced with one of embarrassment. Ms. Hayes fumbled with the papers on her desk, pretending to straighten them, though her hands shook slightly. They had expected a joke, a failure, an easy laugh at a shy girl's expense, but instead, they had witnessed brilliance. Amara stood quietly at the front of the room. Her violin resting against her side, she didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or throw back their laughter at them. She simply stood tall, her silence powerful. She had said everything she needed to with her music, and now the silence was theirs to bear. The room was heavy with emotion. Some students shifted in their chairs, the weight of shame pressing down on them. Others sat still, eyes fixed on Amara as though afraid she might vanish if they blinked. And then slowly a sound broke the silence. It wasn't laughter, not mockery, it was applause, soft at first. A single pair of hands clapping from the back row. Everyone turned. It was a quiet boy who rarely spoke, his eyes bright with admiration. That was incredible, he whispered as he continued clapping. The sound grew one by one, more hands joined. Hesitant at first, then stronger. Soon the classroom was filled with applause. Not the sarcastic clapping they had planned, but real, honest applause. Students rose slightly from their seats, clapping louder and louder. The sound echoed in the room like thunder. Amara blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected it, not from them, not here. But she stood still, her head high, letting the moment wash over her. The boy in the back who had mocked her earlier joined the applause too, though his face was red with shame. He couldn't meet her eyes, but his clapping was steady, as if it was his way of saying he was sorry. The girl in the front row wiped her eyes quickly, pretending she wasn't crying as she clapped as well. Even the teachers joined in. Their applause was hesitant, awkward, but they couldn't ignore what had just happened. Their faces were pale, their smiles tight. They knew they had been wrong, and the guilt in their eyes was clear. Amara's music had turned the entire room upside down. The prank had dissolved into regret, and the same people who had laughed at her were now giving her the respect she had always deserved. She finally allowed herself a small smile, not one of arrogance but of quiet triumph. She had not shouted at them. She had not begged them to stop laughing. She had simply played, and her music had spoken louder than words ever could. The applause eventually softened, fading back into silence. But it wasn't the cruel silence of before. It was a silence filled with respect, with reflection, with regret. Amara looked at her classmates, then at her teachers. Her voice was calm when she finally spoke. "You told me to play as a joke," she said softly. "But the violin is not a joke, it's my voice. It's my life." Her words struck like lightning. Simple but undeniable. The students lowered their heads again. Ashamed, the teachers shifted in their seats. Unable to argue, unable to deny her truth in that moment. Amara was no longer just the quiet girl in the back of the classroom. She was the girl who had silenced cruelty with beauty, the girl who had turned mockery into applause. And as she stood there, her violin in her hands, every person in that room knew they would never forget the day their laughter was silenced by her music. The applause faded slowly, but the silence that followed was different now. It was not filled with cruelty or mockery. It was filled with awe, curiosity, and shame. Every student and every teacher sat waiting, their eyes locked on Amara. They wanted to know how she had done it, how the quiet girl they had laughed at moments ago had just played like a professional. Amara stood at the front of the classroom, her violin resting gently in her hands. For a long moment she said nothing. She simply looked at them, letting the weight of their regret hang in the air. Then in a calm but steady voice she finally spoke. "You all thought this was a joke," she began softly. Her eyes swept across the room, meeting the faces of the classmates who had mocked her. "You gave me the violin because you wanted to laugh. You thought I would fail. You thought I didn't belong here." No one moved. Some students lowered their eyes. Ashamed, others bit their lips, unable to look away. The teachers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Guilt etched into their faces. Amara took a slow breath, her voice growing stronger. "But I have been playing the violin for years, every night while you were asleep. While you were laughing with your friends, I was practicing. My grandmother taught me when I was little. She put the violin in my hands and told me, 'This is your voice. This is how you will be heard when no one listens.'" Gasps rippled through the room. Students exchanged stunned glances. One whispered, "Her grandmother taught her?" Another murmured, "That's why she's so good." Amara smiled faintly, her eyes softening at the memory. "My grandmother wanted to be a musician. She dreamed of playing on stages, of sharing her music with the world. But life was hard and she never got that chance. Instead, she taught me. She told me not to give up even when people laughed. Even when people doubted me, she told me music has power. Power to heal. Power to change hearts." Her voice trembled slightly, but she held her head high. And she was right. I kept practicing, I kept learning, I kept believing. Even when everyone around me thought I had nothing to offer, music became my strength, my escape. My way of speaking when I felt invisible. The students sat stunned. Many of them felt a pang of guilt, remembering how they had teased her for being quiet, how they had whispered cruel things behind her back. They had never known her story, they had never asked. Instead, they had chosen to laugh. Amara's voice grew firmer. "When you handed me this violin today, you wanted me to be a joke, but instead you gave me a stage. You gave me the chance to show you who I really am, and I am not the weak, shy girl you thought I was. I am a musician. I am my grandmother's dream carried forward." A hush fell deeper across the room. Some students wiped at their eyes. Embarrassed to be tearing up, a boy in the front whispered, "She's amazing," unable to contain it. Even the teachers were moved. Mr. Collins, who had been the first to mock her, rubbed his forehead, avoiding her eyes. Ms. Hayes bit her lip, her face red with shame. They had meant to humiliate her, but instead they had exposed their own cruelty. Amara looked directly at them now, her voice calm but sharp. "Teachers are supposed to guide, to support, not to mock. You laughed at me with the rest of them, but today, my music spoke louder than your laughter ever could." The words struck like arrows. The teachers lowered their heads, unable to argue. The truth was undeniable. Amara paused, her eyes glistening but steady. "I play because of my grandmother. I play because she believed in me when no one else did. I play because music is my strength, and I will keep playing. Whether people laugh or not, because laughter fades, but music lasts." The silence that followed was heavy but filled with respect. The students who had once mocked her now looked at her with admiration. Some even clapped again softly, as if to honor not just her performance, but her courage. For the first time, Amara felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She had carried her secret, her practice, her pain, in silence for so long, but now, it was no longer hidden. Her truth was out, and it had changed everything. She lifted the violin once more, holding it close. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "When the world laughs, let your music be louder." And she knew that from this day forward, no one in that classroom would ever laugh at her again. The room was silent again, but this silence was nothing like the one before. Earlier it had been filled with cruelty, waiting for her to fail. Now it was filled with guilt, respect, and awe. Every pair of eyes in the classroom was on Amara, and none of them carried laughter anymore. She stood at the front, her violin still in her hands. Her chin lifted slightly, her presence filled the room. Not with noise, but with dignity. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to scold. Her music and her truth had already done that. The students shifted uncomfortably. Some fidgeted with their pens. Others stared at their desks, ashamed of how they had joined in the laughter. A few risked a glance at Amara, their eyes filled with regret. One boy who had been the loudest to mock her whispered to his friend, "We were wrong." His voice was low, but the weight of it was heavy. A girl in the front row wiped her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She remembered the cruel words she had thrown at Amara earlier, and now felt them sting her own heart. The same girl who she thought would be humiliated had instead humbled everyone else in the room. Even the teachers could not escape the regret. Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair, his face pale. His smug grin was gone, replaced by guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again, knowing no excuse would matter. Ms. Hayes looked down at the floor, twisting a pen nervously between her fingers. She had thought it was a harmless prank, something small, but now she realized she had been cruel. Amara looked at them both, her eyes calm but firm. "You wanted me to play because you thought it would be funny," she said softly. "But you were wrong. You thought I would fail, but you were wrong. You thought I had nothing, but you were wrong." Her words stung sharper than any scolding because they were true. The teachers shifted again, their shame clear. Neither of them could look her in the eyes. Then something happened that no one expected. One student began to clap slowly but firmly. It wasn't mocking this time, it was real. Soon another joined, and then another. The applause grew louder, filling the classroom. The same students who had laughed earlier now clapped with sincerity, their faces red with regret, but lit with admiration. Amara's heart swelled as she stood there listening to the sound. It wasn't the applause that mattered, it was what it meant. The prank had failed. The laughter had turned into respect. And though they had tried to make her small, she had shown them she was far greater than they ever imagined. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "One day they will hear you." And today, they finally had. Amara gave a small nod, her voice steady. "I don't need your apologies," she said, "because the music already spoke for me. But I hope you remember this moment the next time you want to laugh at someone for trying. The next time you think someone isn't good enough, because you might be wrong again." The room stayed quiet after her words. The students lowered their heads, taking in the lesson she had given them. The teachers swallowed hard, the regret clear in their faces. They had not just failed as leaders, they had failed as human beings. And Amara's music had exposed it. Slowly, Amara turned, walking back to her seat. Every step felt lighter than before. She didn't rush, she didn't hide, she walked proudly, the violin still in her hands like a crown she had earned. The students watched her in silence, and for the first time there was no whisper. No joke, no cruel smirk, only respect. When she sat down, a quiet strength settled around her. She knew her life in that classroom would never be the same. The teachers who once mocked her would think twice before speaking. The classmates who once laughed at her would never forget how she had silenced them with music. The prank had ended, but its memory would remain with them forever. Not as a joke, but as a lesson. Amara touched the violin gently, whispering in her heart, "This was for you, Grandma." She felt tears sting her eyes, but this time they weren't from pain or shame. They were from triumph. She had walked into that moment as a target of laughter, but she walked out as something far greater. She was no longer invisible, she was unforgettable. And as the school day moved on, the story spread quietly through the halls, how the teachers had set up a prank, and how it had backfired in the most powerful way, how a girl who was supposed to be humiliated had turned the room upside down with her talent. By the end of the day, Amara's name was on everyone's lips, but she didn't care for gossip or attention. She only cared for the truth, that she had stood her ground, played her music, and turned cruelty into regret. It was her victory, and no one could ever take it away. The classroom never forgot that day, but Amara's story didn't end when the applause faded. Word of what happened spread through the school like fire by the afternoon. Students from other classes were whispering about the quiet girl who had silenced laughter with her violin. Amara walked through the halls with her head high, and for the first time no one laughed when she passed. The same students who had mocked her now moved aside, some even smiling nervously as if they didn't know how to act around her anymore. She wasn't invisible anymore, she was unforgettable. The teachers couldn't escape it either. Mr. Collins and Ms. Hayes avoided each other's eyes for the rest of the day, embarrassed by their role in the prank. They knew the story would reach the principal, and perhaps even the parents, but worse than that, they knew it had already reached the students' hearts. That evening, Amara returned home and placed the violin back in its case. Her grandmother's photo sat on the table nearby. She touched the frame gently, whispering, "They heard me today, Grandma, just like you said they would." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were warm, proud tears. The days that followed brought even more change. The school announced a talent showcase, and to everyone's surprise, Amara was asked to perform, not as a joke but as the main act. The same classmates who had once laughed now crowded around her, asking if she would play again. Some apologized quietly, others said nothing but looked at her with respect. When the day of the showcase arrived, the auditorium was packed, parents, teachers, and students filled the seats. The lights dimmed, and Amara stepped onto the stage, violin in hand. For a moment, she felt the same nerves she had felt that day in class, but then she remembered how she had stood strong, and the fear vanished. She lifted her bow and began to play. The music filled the auditorium, more powerful than ever. Her grandmother's lessons flowed through every note. The audience sat spellbound, some cried, others closed their eyes and let the music carry them away. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, louder than anything she had ever imagined. People stood on their feet, cheering. The principal shook her hand, telling her she had a gift that deserved to be shared beyond the school walls. And so Amara's journey began. No longer just the quiet girl in the back of the classroom. She became the girl whose music carried a story, one of pain, resilience, and triumph. She joined competitions, played in local events, and every time she held her violin, she carried her grandmother's dream with her. The prank that was supposed to humiliate her had instead given her a stage, a spark that set her future in motion. The laughter that once surrounded her name was gone, replaced with admiration, inspiration, and respect years later. When Amara walked on to bigger stages, people clapped not because of her age or appearance, but because her music touched their hearts. And every time she played, she thought back to that day, to the classroom full of laughter, and she smiled, because that was the day she learned the truth. Laughter fades, but music lasts forever.